Got Eustace coming at you with some late night math. This is about ethylene oxide risk in St. James Parish. The existing, the permitted, the Formosa proposal based on data from May 2021, information from EPA as revealed in over the summer, revealed and not revealed. But we're following through on those implications from the Office of Inspector General about Region 6, their lack of communication on ethylene oxide risk and risk of cancer. We're following through on the results from the tumor registry showing the relationship between cancer risk and cancer incidence, namely that it only affects some of us, right? There are social determinants of health and there are social determinants of cancer. The United States is a racist place. Nationally, Louisiana is a racist place. And unfortunately, St. James is also affected by racism. The public purse is only spent for certain people. And those people who are able to get public expenditures because of political representation, the better health outcomes are related to that. Where you don't have that political power, you see a higher rate of cancer incidence. It's an important thing to keep in mind. But let's go through the slides. These facilities we're talking about harm everyone. Ethylene oxide is produced by major climate polluters. So if you're tired of the hurricanes, you're tired of the ethylene oxide facilities. Moral leadership reminds us that this is the moment we have to act. We don't have any more time. We're on the edge, and we need to work to care for nature so that nature can care for us. There's nowhere more true than St. James Parish. The wetlands are our home. It's our food and flood protection. Our failure to protect the land, to protect the air, it comes right back on us. It's an instant karma in the form of Hurricane Ida. What goes up comes down. You can see this map of the largest climate changers, the largest carbon polluting facilities. The red lines are power stations. The yellow lines are ethylene oxide stations. And I don't have Formosa on this list because it's from 2018. You can see the very large bubble around CF Industries in Donaldsonville, just upriver from St. James. Formosa, as permitted, would be off the chart. The chart only goes up to 10 million. So the bubble around Formosa, in terms of its impact to the climate, would be the largest on this map. And these are some world-class climate changing companies right here in Louisiana that we have. So these facilities harm us all. They threaten our existence on the planet. They also harm the least of our people. They harm the least of our people the most. Different moral leaders have said we live in a throwaway culture and we easily throw away plastic and we throw away things and we throw away people. We can't continue to do that and survive. So just because there's cancer risk from ethylene oxide, we'll get into the maps. Not all areas show incidence of cancer. You can be at risk, but that doesn't necessarily lead to harm. But it does lead to harm in St. James because we see increased cancer incidence in Black areas, in poor areas, and of course in areas that are Black and poor. Percent race is indicated by the color of these dots, percent poverty by the size. You know, this is Louisiana. We have a legacy of segregation and hurting our Black brothers and sisters with our government. So you see a lot of the purple, a lot of the blue dots are large. You see a lot of the orange dots, less so. But the blue dots that are smaller are still above the line, still have disproportionate incidence compared to risk. You see that the orange dots that are larger also show increased incidence to risk. They're above that line. And you can kind of see that there's that the community with the most risk on this chart is not very far above the line. It's a white community with a relatively low poverty rate. So we're experiencing as a culture, we live in two worlds when it comes to cancer. We can look around the room and see, people live in different zip codes. What color you look like probably relates to what zip code you're in. What zip code you're in is going to tell you, it does predict whether or not you're going to be affected by the cancer risk. So our white brothers and sisters are just living a different reality, and they hear about the cancer from our Black brothers and sisters, but they don't believe them. They don't believe them because of racism, and they don't believe them because they're actually living a different experience. They're living a different experience. At least that's what the statistical analysis of the LA Tumor Registry data shows us. So that's a challenge. So if you are, my white brothers and sisters here tonight, I will challenge you to listen 3 times to our Black brothers and sisters, because they're not lying. I think they're often treated as if they're lying. Furthermore, ethylene oxide, as it increases, it doesn't just increase all cancer risk, it increases certain cancer risk and certain ailments. And those ailments include breast cancer and miscarriages. Being forced to terminate a pregnancy is not something that all of us here tonight are going to have to deal with. Only some of us, right? Those of us who can get pregnant and can experience a miscarriage are of a gender that's generally not listened to as well. So, the risks result in harm among the population with the least amount of political power. This is what the logic shows us. This is what the numbers show us. So it behooves us who don't have to live with the risk of breast cancer to maybe shut up and listen to the people who have lived with breast cancer, people who face the risk of breast cancer. That's what morality would demand and what justice would demand. Well, let's get back to the numbers. What do we have? Most of the information here tonight I'm presenting based on LDEQ permits for Formosa and other ethylene oxide emitting facilities. There's also actual emissions from LDEQ. I'm going to show a short chart. The maps of risk are based on permitted emissions. And, you know, there's a lot of things that are not in the actual information. And when EPA, there's a lot of incorrect things in the LDQ data. And when EPA started asking about it, many companies lowered their previous reports. They retroactively lowered their emissions. We don't have access to any of the rationale behind that. That's frustrating. What we need is fence line monitoring of ethylene oxide concentration at these facilities. And for St. James, I'm going to go over which facilities you should be concerned with based on the risk, based on the science, the science that EPA has done above and beyond TCEQ's analysis, which dismisses ethylene oxide risk without looking at the EPA data and analysis. EPA can be bad at a lot of things, but they are on pretty solid ground when it comes to scientific analysis. They're world class on that, even if they don't do a lot of enforcement actions. That's what they're known for around the world. So we have to take their risk calculations seriously and not deflect from them just because Texas says something. Really, we need fence line monitoring around all facilities, but I'm going to describe which ones that St. James should be concerned with, because there's some that St. James doesn't need to be concerned with. These are the actual, based on LDQ data. The companies have lowered these, but this is what we're available to see, And in 2015, 23 tons from Mississippi River facilities I'm going to discuss tonight. 2017, it lowered. 2019, it went back up. So it varies. There's been an overall decrease, but Formosa's permit, 7.7 tons, could overwhelm whatever decreases there have been, which are pretty variable, and then it seems to go up and down. Yeah. EPA looked for impact only within 50 kilometers. Our modeling shows that there's potentially impact much further away at the risk levels they're concerned with. So when we look at the 101 million risk levels around each of these facilities, Formosa affects District 5 and District 4 in an unacceptable way. Dow, Louisiana, and Plaquemine affects Baton Rouge, St. Gabriel, and other small towns on the river in an unacceptable way. Shell and BASF Geismar affect Geismar, Gonzales, and areas west of Donaldsonville in an unacceptable way. And again, we're looking at these maps, these blobs, and then the green areas are environmental justice communities, areas that are disparately Black, areas that are disparately poor. You can see that there's a lot of poverty around facilities up and down the river. There's a lot of poverty in African-American areas up and down the river next to facilities. What this means is that the increased risk is going to increase the cancer incidence in these green geographies, which in St. James Parish is District 5, District 4, District 3, District 2. And as I go through this, I should add, I'm ignoring cancer risk from oil refineries, which is not insignificant. We're just talking about the risk from ethylene oxide. And if we just talk about the risk for ethylene oxide, Formosa is exceeding the acceptable limit in districts 4 and 5, areas that are susceptible to getting the cancer from the cancer risk, the pollution cancer, the cancer risk from pollution. But at least half of the districts in St. James, slightly more than half, should be concerned about this issue in general, because there are some bigger facilities when it comes to ethylene oxide, bigger and nastier, particularly the Dow facilities. When we look at cumulative risk in areas in St. James 4 and 5, and apologies for not doing 3 and 2. I will be asking for that. We see that the cumulative risk is above 0.02 micrograms per cubic meter, the acceptable threshold in all 3 of the locations studied. There's 3 colors, the 3 locations in 2 St. James districts. One of those areas, a residential area in the 5th district, it exceeds the acceptable risk from Formosa alone. And a couple of other areas are also put over the line by the combination of Formosa and the other facilities, particularly Dow, Louisiana, in Plaquemine to our west. But Shell and Geismar, as well as Dow Union Carbide to the east in St. Charles Parish, affect St. James, and they affect these 3 locations in St. James 4 and 5. So you'll see that, excuse me, the other facilities, BASF does affect, but it's not contributing the most. Evonik, the former Shell facility, now called Evonik, now owned by Evonik, contributing a little bit. The BCP and Tamanco facilities in St. Gabriel contribute the least, and they're barely on the charts. So again, let's look at risk levels. These are 2 different risk levels represented by 2 different colors to the polygon in St. James. You see that it exceeds, risk exceeds acceptable limits in 4 and 5, which are environmental justice areas. And the risk exceeds the action level, or the level at which we're concerned about ethylene oxide in the entirety of St. James Parish, and even out to Reserve, even out to Baton Rouge, even down to Morgan City. If the only facility polluting ethylene oxide in Louisiana was the Formosa proposal, it has the potential to do bad things as far east as Reserve, as far north as West Baton Rouge, Prairieville, Gonzales, Ascension Parish, and then down on to Morgan City even. All of these places face the 1 in 1 million, sometimes called an action level, an area which you should be concerned, because there could be a bad day. The facility is still permitted to emit this amount at that risk level. You could be a vulnerable person. Who knows? You might even be in town during a hurricane when the facility shuts down and under force majeure exceeds their permit. There might be plumes for months after a hurricane, let's say. And they might go in a certain direction. They could affect even Reserve, but they definitely could affect the whole parish. When facilities like this shut down, they can emit beyond their permits. This is just permitted levels of impact. So if you're in Gramercy, what you want for this action level risk, I think, is fence line monitoring 24/7, solar powered, so it doesn't go down. You can't take the monitors away after a hurricane because that's when the facilities are emitting the most and emitting the most cumulative over months. So the amount of junk coming out of this thing needs to be watched during those times if you're in Gramercy. And if you're in 4 and 5, you really need fence line monitoring. Like, it's a need to know thing. You need to know whether to evacuate, really. Now, a lot of the risk is based on long-term effects. If you live in an area for years on end, but, you know, the miscarriages comes in St. Gabriel, you know, there was the pattern of miscarriages came all at once. You know, it wasn't a long-term impact of the pollution. It was a much shorter term effect. You know, because this risk is kind of it's an average over time, over years, but that's not how we actually experience pollution, right? We'll experience 95% of the pollution on just a handful of days, usually. You can call it spikes, you can call it whatever, but the amount of pollution that would affect Gramercy would not be day in, day out. It would be on those bad days. We all know, you know, for example, I live in New Orleans and I'm affected by the Chalmette refinery in a chronic way, but I've only, you know, coughed and had a headache and felt ill for a day from the Chalmette refinery when it had an explosion in 2020 after the oil price crash, right? So that's the only day it made me sick. I live in New Orleans, far away from Chalmette. The facility still made me sick. Will that amount of benzene exposure that I experienced that day give me cancer? But certainly I was out of commission and it affected my lung health. Okay, so again, everyone in St. James is affected by the Dow facility in Louisiana and needs fence line monitoring. You know, it does not exceed the 101 million acceptable limit for St. James, but it does in St. Gabriel and it does in Plaquemine. But you should be worried about this facility if it has a bad day, if it's hit by a hurricane. Same with BASF and Shell. At the 1 in 1 million risk level, both of these facilities west of St. James Parish affect almost the entirety of, oh no, they do. They both affect the entirety of St. James Parish. They could have bad days that affect hatchery. The risk from Evonik in reserve, which is a much smaller light green, and Dow Union Carbide in Taft and Hanville is large. It's mostly affecting reserve. And this is why reserve Louisiana has some of the highest cancer risk in the United States. Because you add the Denka facility, you add the Marathon facility, and it's not looking great for folks in St. John Parish. And again, reserve is majority Black, so socially, their health outcomes are determined by this environmental risk more than the white communities. At the 1 in 1 million risk level, both Evonik and Dow Union Carbide affect all of St. James. So as in St. James, you should want fence line monitoring for these facilities when they have a bad day. There's a little bit about NESHAP and kind of the two-step risk decision framework that the EPA goes through. It's kind of their standard. That's why we have this acceptable limit and then a 1 in 1 million risk level or action level, a level at which we start to become concerned. So, what are we looking at in the Welcome Freetown area, St. James District 5? A little snapshot of the risk that exists, and there's also the risk that's permitted to exist, I should say. So this is all based on facility permits. At the 1 in 1 million risk level, it's 231 times that level. So it's 231 times when we're concerned, when we want to be looking out for cancer incidents from the pollution. Especially because we're talking about Freetown and Welcome, which fit the profile. They're more susceptible to cancers. By individual facility, Formosa alone exceeds this acceptable limit in residential areas around Welcome. So that's bad for that community. It's bad for women trying to have children in that community. And the rest are at the 1 in 1 million. They exceed the 1 in 1 million risk level to different degrees, at least above 1 times, and usually multiples of tens of times. The only facilities we're not really worried about if we're playing in Welcome Park are BCP and Tamiko and St. Gabriel. Those are too far away and too small to really statistically affect Welcome as permitted. So what do we at Healthy Golf need? What do we think is acceptable? What's the morality now that we know that these facilities will cause cancer if they increase ethylene oxide pollution in Welcome? Well, one, we need health surveys now. The tumor registry data, we're about at the limit of its utility. It doesn't tell you enough about the incidence of cancer. We can ascertain that it's generally related statistically to areas that are poor, areas that are Black. We know this generally. What we want are health surveys in St. James, because there's many causes of cancer. There's many complications around health, and we want to know how to fix those. How do we mitigate that? How do we mitigate the suffering? How do we have a sustainable economy? Because there's no economy without our health. US EPA and the disease registry associated with EPA must conduct health surveys in St. James. There's overwhelming evidence that this is a problem already. And to permit the FGLA facility to make the problem worse is cruelty. And it's cruelty of a certain population on another certain population that doesn't have, politicians in their pocket to help them out, doesn't have the resources to mitigate the risks. It's cruelty of men on women. It's cruelty of white people upon their Black brothers and sisters. So I do beg you to reconsider your support for Formosa Plastics if you consider yourself a moral person. Everything else, they must be monitored. These larger facilities that affect St. James. If you live in Gramercy, you don't want those bad days to affect you. Fence line monitoring for you in Gramercy, that can make a difference. The plume comes, the plume might only last a couple hours. The wind might only be blowing in your direction for a limited time. With fence line monitoring and notification, you can change your plan, you can adapt, you can evacuate, you can shelter in place, you can avoid, 90% of the pollution that's happening in that one day. So fence line monitoring works. Notification with fence line monitoring is amazing at helping people mitigate risk. So if you're in St. James, you should care about all of these facilities and demand fence line monitoring. And even though BCP and Tamanco don't affect you in St. James, I would hope that you care enough about your brothers and sisters in St. Gabriel that, we need this nationwide, we need this statewide. Permitted emissions must be lowered until risk is below the acceptable limits. That's why it's the acceptable limit. Facilities above the 1 in 1 million risk level must be monitored for those bad days. And we don't need layoffs as a result of this. Oil companies are perpetually cutting costs by cutting labor, by pushing people into contract positions. No, polluters must not punish our communities that they're also making sick. The companies can take this hit, they can do the right thing, they can create more jobs with this monitoring, they can create more jobs from the necessary communications about the acceptable risks of ethylene oxide. We need money for emergency. All parishes need money for emergency planning, emergency response. And we need emergency communications from these facilities. They need to pay into the parish fund for those incidents. And, honestly, the new facilities must be denied on the basis of cancer risk, the impact to the local economy in District 4 and 5, as well as the rest of the parish. The risk to us all from climate change and hurricanes that Formosa represents, and the cruelty, the environmental racism that Formosa Plastics represents. So, thanks very much. Yes.